The room went quiet the second the boy touched the piano bench, but not the good kind of quiet. It was the kind of quiet that comes right before someone gets hurt with words instead of hands. Daniel stood at the edge of the stage with his hands shoved into the pockets of a jacket that was 2 sizes too big, watching a room full of strangers decide who he was before he had played a single note. Someone in the front row let out a short laugh. Another voice, a girl's, whispered something about his shoes, and a ripple of giggles spread across the seats like a stone thrown into still water. Daniel felt his ears burn, but he did not turn around. He had promised himself he would not turn around. The audition hall smelled like old wood polish and dust, the kind of smell that clings to a building that has hosted 100 years of nervous young people trying to prove they belonged somewhere. Tall windows let in slanted afternoon light that cut across the stage in golden bars, and dust floated lazily inside those bars like tiny stars caught in a net. At the center of the stage sat a grand piano, black and enormous, its lid propped open like a mouth waiting to speak. Daniel walked toward it the way a person walks toward a decision they cannot take back. Behind a long table near the front sat the judges, 3 of them, but only one mattered. Her name was Eleanor Vance, and she ran the city's most respected youth music program with a reputation sharp enough to cut glass. She had discovered singers who went on to fill concert halls, and pianists whose names now appeared on posters in 3 languages. She did not smile easily, and today her patience was already thin. She had sat through 4 hours of auditions, most of them forgettable, a few of them painful, and she had exactly 12 minutes left before she needed to leave for another appointment. She glanced at her watch, then at the clipboard in front of her, then at the boy walking across the stage in shoes with a hole starting near the toe. "Name," she said, not looking up. "Daniel," he answered. His voice cracked slightly on the single word, and somewhere behind him, someone snorted. "Last name, Daniel Ashworth." Eleanor finally looked up. She studied him for a moment, not unkindly, but with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read a person's nerves before they even sat down. She could tell this boy had not come from money. His jacket was borrowed or second-hand, his hair needed a trim, and his hands, when he finally lifted them toward the keys, trembled just slightly, like leaves before a storm arrives. "Whenever you're ready," she said, and there was no warmth in it, only routine. Daniel lowered himself onto the bench. The wood creaked under him, and somewhere in the seats, a boy named Oliver leaned toward his friend and whispered loud enough for half the room to hear. $10 says he can't even play scales." More laughter. Quiet, but sharp, the kind that finds every gap in a person's confidence and slips inside. Daniel's jaw tightened. He stared down at the keys, black and white and perfectly ordinary, and for one terrifying second his mind went completely blank, as if every note he had ever learned had simply vanished into the golden light pouring through the windows. Then he thought of a small apartment with a leaking ceiling. He thought of a woman with silver hair humming quietly while she stirred a pot on the stove. He thought of 2 broken keys on an old upright piano that never quite sounded right, no matter how many times someone tried to fix them. He thought of headphones plugged into a cheap keyboard so the neighbors would not complain, of fingers moving silently over rubber pads because there was no real piano to practice on some nights. He thought of a voice that always said the same thing whenever he doubted himself. "They can laugh at your shoes, they can never laugh at your hands." Daniel took a breath, and his fingers came down on the keys. The first note was soft, almost hesitant, like a question asked in a whisper. The second note answered it. Within 4 bars, the laughter in the room began to fade, not because anyone told it to, but because it simply had nowhere left to live. The melody that spilled from the piano was not the simple exercise printed on the audition sheet. It was something else entirely, something that did not belong to any songbook in the building. It moved slowly at first, mournful and searching, like footsteps in an empty hallway, and then, without warning, it opened up into something bigger, something that filled every corner of the hall the way sunlight fills a room when curtains are pulled back. Eleanor Vance set down her pen. She had heard thousands of auditions across her career. She had heard technically perfect pianists who left her feeling nothing at all, and she had heard clumsy, uneven playing that somehow moved her to tears. What she was hearing now was neither of those things. It was something rare, something she had only encountered a handful of times in her whole life, the kind of playing that did not just demonstrate skill but told a story, note by note, as clearly as if the boy were speaking in words instead of sound. The girl who had whispered about his shoes sat frozen, her mouth slightly open. Oliver, who had bet $10 on Daniel failing, had gone completely still, his smirk erased as if it had never existed. Even the other judges at the table, who had been shuffling papers and checking phones minutes earlier, now sat with their hands folded, eyes fixed on the boy at the piano. as though they were afraid that looking away might break the spell. Daniel did not notice any of it. For the length of that piece, the room disappeared. The judges disappeared. The boy who had mocked him disappeared. There was only the piano, the music, and the memory of a small kitchen where a woman used to say his name like it was the most important word in the world. The melody rose again, stronger now, carrying something that sounded almost like triumph woven through the sadness, as if joy and grief had learned to walk side by side. His fingers moved faster, but never careless, every note landing exactly where it needed to land, exactly when it needed to land. Somewhere in the middle of the piece, his eyes closed, not because he had memorized it, though he had, but because he no longer needed his eyes to see where his hands belonged. Outside the tall windows, the afternoon light shifted slightly, and a soft breeze pushed against the glass. Inside, nobody in that hall moved. A janitor who had been sweeping the hallway outside paused in the doorway, broom forgotten in his hand, listening. A younger student waiting for her own audition later in the day pressed her palm against her chest, feeling something she could not yet name. Daniel brought the piece home slowly, the notes softening again, circling back to the same gentle question that had opened the piece. Except now it did not sound like a question anymore. It sounded like an answer. His hands came to rest on the final chord, and he let it ring out until the sound faded completely into silence. For a long moment, nobody said anything at all. Then Eleanor Vance, a woman known throughout the city for her composure, for her sharp critiques and her carefully guarded expressions, felt her eyes sting with tears she had not expected and did not particularly want to explain. She blinked them back quickly, professionally, the way she had trained herself to do for 20 years, but something in her chest had shifted, and she knew it would not shift back. The silence broke all at once. Somewhere in the seats someone began to clap, uncertain at first, and then the sound spread, hand after hand joining in, until the entire hall was filled with applause that had nowhere to hide the surprise in it. Oliver, red in the face, clapped along with everyone else, unable to meet Daniel's eyes. The girl who had commented on his shoes sat with her hands pressed together near her chin, as though she were praying or apologizing, perhaps both. Daniel opened his eyes and blinked at the sudden noise, disoriented for a second, unsure whether the applause was real or some trick his exhausted mind was playing on him. He looked toward the judges' table and found Eleanor Vance staring back at him, her clipboard forgotten, her pen rolled off the table and onto the floor without her noticing. "What?" she said slowly, her voice quieter than before, almost careful. "Was that piece? I don't recognize it." Daniel's throat tightened. He had never played it for anyone outside his small apartment before. He had never expected to play it for anyone at all. "I wrote it," he said, "for my grandmother." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, as though trying to fit this quiet, nervous boy together with the storm of feeling he had just poured out onto the keys. She glanced down at her clipboard, at the audition sheet with his name printed in small, careful handwriting, and then back up at him. "Sit down for a moment, Daniel," she said. "I have questions." He had never left the bench, but he understood what she meant. He was not being dismissed. He was being asked to stay. Behind him, in the seats where laughter had lived only minutes earlier, there was now only stunned, respectful silence. The kind that follows a person who has just proven, without saying a single defensive word, that they were never who anyone assumed them to be. And somewhere far across the city, in a small apartment with a leaking ceiling and a piano with 2 broken keys, an old woman folded laundry and hummed softly to herself, completely unaware that everything in her grandson's life was about to change. 3 years earlier, that same apartment had been much quieter and much colder. Daniel was 13 years old, sitting on the floor of a hospital hallway with his knees pulled up to his chest, listening to 2 doctors speak in hushed voices to his grandmother, Ruth Ashworth, a small woman with sharp eyes and a spine that never seemed to bend, no matter how heavy the news. His parents had died in a car accident when he was 6, and since that day, Ruth had raised him alone, working 2 jobs, first as a seamstress during the day and then cleaning offices at night, just to keep a roof over both their heads. That day in the hospital hallway, the doctors were not talking about Daniel. They were talking about Ruth's heart, and the word they kept repeating, gently but firmly, was weak. Ruth walked out of that appointment with a folder of papers and a list of medications, and she never once let Daniel see her frightened. She took his hand in the parking lot, squeezed it the way she always did, and said the same thing she had said to him 100 times before whenever the world felt too big and too unfair. "We keep going, Daniel. That's the only trick there is." He believed her, mostly because he had no other choice, and partly because there was something in the steadiness of her voice that made even frightening things feel survivable. That night, back in their small apartment, Ruth sat at the old upright piano in the corner of the living room, the one with two keys that stuck slightly whenever they were pressed, and she played a slow, simple melody she had learned as a girl in a village far from the city. Daniel sat beside her on the narrow bench, his shoulder against hers, and watched her fingers move across keys that had been played so many times the paint had worn away in places. "Your grandfather taught me this piano," she told him, not for the first time. "And someday you will play it better than either of us." Daniel had laughed at that, a small, disbelieving laugh, because at 13 he had never taken a single music lesson and had no reason to think he had any talent at all. But Ruth insisted, gently and persistently, the way she insisted on most things that mattered. She found a community center 2 neighborhoods over that offered free lessons on Saturday mornings, and every week, rain or shine, she walked him there herself, sitting in the hallway outside the practice room with her hands folded in her lap, listening through the thin door. The lessons were basic at first, scales and simple songs, the kind every beginner learns before they understand why any of it matters. But something happened in Daniel during those Saturday mornings that surprised even his teacher, a patient older man named Peter Lindquist, who had spent decades teaching children who mostly lost interest within a few months. Daniel did not lose interest. If anything, his interest grew sharper each week, until Peter began giving him more advanced pieces, watching with quiet astonishment as the boy absorbed them faster than students twice his age. "He has an ear," Peter told Ruth one Saturday, standing in the hallway while Daniel packed up his things inside. "Not just for playing notes, for feeling what they mean. That is rare, Mrs. Ashworth. That cannot be taught." Ruth had smiled at that, a small, proud smile that she rarely allowed herself, and on the walk home that day she had squeezed Daniel's hand a little tighter than usual. The trouble came almost a year later, when the community center lost its funding and the free lessons ended without warning. Peter Lindquist apologized more than once, explaining that the building itself might close if new donors could not be found, and that he had no way to continue teaching without a proper facility. Daniel remembered standing outside the locked doors of the center on a Saturday morning, staring at a handwritten sign taped to the glass, feeling something inside his chest sink lower than it had ever sunk before. Ruth had tried, in the months that followed, to find another way. She asked neighbors if anyone knew a teacher willing to work for very little. She looked into cheaper community programs across the city, but most were too far away, or too expensive, or already full. Money was always the same tight knot no matter how she tried to loosen it. Her sewing work brought in barely enough for rent and groceries, and after the diagnosis, a portion of every paycheck now had to go toward medication that kept her heart working properly. One evening, Daniel came home from school to find Ruth sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of bills spread out in front of her, her reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead, her lips pressed into a thin, tired line. He did not need to ask what was wrong. He had seen that same expression enough times to understand it without words. "I can stop with piano," he said quietly, standing in the doorway. "It's fine. I don't need lessons." Ruth looked up at him sharply, and for a moment her tiredness seemed to burn away entirely, replaced by something fierce and unshakable. "You will never stop playing," she said, "not because of money, not because of anything. Do you understand me?" He nodded, though he did not fully understand yet how she intended to make that promise true. He found out a few weeks later, when he came home from school and discovered a set of cheap foam practice pads sitting on the kitchen table, printed with the black and white pattern of piano keys, along with an old pair of headphones and a small second-hand electronic keyboard that Ruth had found at a thrift shop 2 bus rides away. "It is not the same as a real piano," she admitted, watching his face carefully. "But your hands still need to move. Your ears still need to listen. We will make it work until we find something better." And so, night after night, Daniel practiced in silence, wearing headphones that let him hear the notes only inside his own head while his fingers pressed down on keys that made almost no sound at all in the real world. He practiced on the broken old upright piano too, whenever Ruth's schedule allowed her to sit beside him and listen, ignoring the 2 keys that stuck and produced a dull, muted thud instead of a proper note. He learned to work around them, to compose small pauses or clever substitutions into his playing, so the broken keys would not interrupt the music. In a strange way, those 2 broken keys taught him more about creativity than any lesson ever had, forcing him to solve problems with sound the way other musicians rarely had to. He wrote his first original piece that year, a short, simple melody meant to make Ruth smile after a particularly difficult week of medical appointments. It was clumsy, technically speaking, full of small mistakes and uneven rhythms, but Ruth cried when she heard it anyway, sitting very still on the narrow piano bench with her hand pressed against her chest. "You have your grandfather's gift," she told him that night. "He used to say that music was the only language that never lied. Over the following years, Daniel kept writing. He filled notebooks with scraps of melodies, ideas scribbled down on bus rides or during quiet moments at school, when a tune would suddenly arrive in his head, uninvited but impossible to ignore. He borrowed books from the library about music theory, teaching himself concepts that Peter Lindquist had never gotten the chance to cover. He watched free lessons online whenever he could find a library computer with enough time left on the clock. Slowly, without any formal teacher guiding him, Daniel became something rarer than a well-trained student. He became an artist, shaped entirely by necessity, by love, and by the stubborn refusal of an old woman to let her grandson's gift disappear, simply because life had made it inconvenient. It was Ruth who first heard about the scholarship recital audition, spotted almost by accident on a flyer taped to a corkboard outside the community library. The flyer promised a full scholarship to the city's most respected youth music program, along with private lessons, access to real instruments, and mentorship from established musicians. Ruth read the flyer 3 times before tearing it carefully from the corkboard and folding it into her coat pocket. That evening, she placed it on the kitchen table in front of Daniel without a word. "I'm not good enough for something like that," he said immediately, barely glancing at it. "Those people study with real teachers. I've been practicing on foam pads and a broken piano." Ruth sat down across from him, her expression calm but immovable, the same expression she wore whenever she had already made up her mind about something important. "Do you remember what your grandfather always told me?" she asked, whenever I doubted myself. Daniel shook his head slowly, though he suspected he already knew the shape of the answer, even if not the exact words. "He said the piano does not care what shoes you are wearing when you sit down. It only cares what is in your hands and in your heart when you begin to play." Daniel looked down at the flyer again, at the bold black letters advertising a chance he had never once believed was meant for someone like him. Ruth reached across the table and placed her hand over his, her skin thin and lined with age, her grip still surprisingly strong. "They can laugh at your shoes," she said quietly. "They can never laugh at your hands." That night, Daniel sat alone at the old upright piano, long after Ruth had gone to bed, working carefully around the 2 broken keys, composing something new, something that carried inside it every hospital hallway, every silent practice session with foam pads and headphones, every sacrifice his grandmother had made without ever once complaining. By the time he finished, the first pale light of morning had begun creeping through the thin curtains, and he knew, with a certainty he had never felt about anything before, exactly what he would play if he ever found the courage to walk into that audition room. Weeks later, sitting once again at the kitchen table, Ruth filled out the audition form herself, her handwriting careful and neat despite her tired eyes, while Daniel stood behind her chair, chewing his lip, terrified and hopeful in equal measure. When she finished, she looked up at him and smiled, the same proud, quiet smile she had given him after his very first lesson. "Whatever happens in that room," she said, "you already know how to make music that means something. Nobody can take that away from you, no matter what they say when you first sit down." Daniel had carried those words with him into the audition hall weeks later, through every whispered laugh, through every doubtful glance from strangers who judged him before he ever touched the keys. And now, sitting on that stage with Eleanor Vance staring at him with tears she refused to acknowledge, he understood exactly why his grandmother's words had mattered so much. They had not simply prepared him to play well. They had prepared him to believe, completely and without hesitation, that he belonged in that room, long before anyone else in it agreed. Eleanor Vance did not usually invite anyone backstage after an audition, but she made an exception that afternoon, waving Daniel toward a small side office just off the main hall, its walls lined with framed photographs of former students who had gone on to fill concert halls across the country. Daniel sat stiffly in a chair across from her desk, his hands still faintly trembling, though now from adrenaline rather than fear. Eleanor closed the door behind them and studied him for a long moment before speaking. "That piece," she said. "How long have you been writing music?" "A few years," Daniel answered. "Nothing formal. I don't have a real teacher anymore." "Anymore?" He explained, briefly, and without asking for sympathy, about the community center, about Peter Lindquist, about the funding that disappeared before he ever finished learning everything the older man had wanted to teach him. Eleanor listened without interrupting, her sharp eyes softening slightly with every sentence, though her expression remained carefully composed, the way it always did when she was thinking several steps ahead. "You wrote that piece for your grandmother," she said finally. "Tell me about her." Daniel hesitated only briefly before the words came, quiet and unguarded, describing Ruth's 2 jobs, her weak heart, the broken piano keys, the foam practice pads and the borrowed headphones. He had not planned to share any of it. Something about the room, about the silence after his playing, about Eleanor's steady attention, made the truth easier to speak than he expected. By the time he finished, Eleanor had leaned back in her chair, one hand resting against her chin, studying him, the way a jeweler studies a stone, before deciding whether it is worth cutting. "I am prepared to offer you the scholarship," she said. "Full tuition, private lessons, access to proper instruments. This program has produced some of the finest young musicians in the country. And frankly, Daniel, in 20 years of auditions, I have rarely heard anything like what you played today." Daniel's chest tightened with something he barely recognized, a feeling too large and too sudden to name. He opened his mouth to thank her, but Eleanor held up a hand, not finished yet. "However," she continued, "this scholarship comes with visibility. Donors fund this program because they want results they can point to, students they can showcase. If I offer this to you, your story will be told publicly, and your talent will be tested publicly as well. Not everyone will be as generous with their judgment as I am prepared to be right now." Daniel did not fully understand what she meant, not yet, but he nodded anyway, too overwhelmed to ask the questions that should have occurred to him. Eleanor stood, extending her hand across the desk, and Daniel shook it, feeling as though the entire trajectory of his life had shifted in the span of a single afternoon. Word spread quickly through the theater in the days that followed. Students who had witnessed the audition described it to friends who had not been present, and the story grew slightly larger and more dramatic with each retelling, the way stories often do. By the end of the week, most of the youth program had heard some version of the boy who silenced the room, and opinions divided sharply along lines that had little to do with music and everything to do with assumption. Not everyone was pleased. Among the skeptics was a senior board member named Charlotte Whitfield, a woman who had funded the program for over a decade and who took personal pride in the polish and prestige of every student who wore its name. When Eleanor brought Daniel's scholarship proposal before the small governing committee the following week, Charlotte's reaction was immediate and pointed. "A full scholarship, without formal training, without any prior recognition," Charlotte said, flipping through the thin folder Eleanor had prepared. "Eleanor, I trust your ear more than almost anyone's, but our donors expect polish. Pedigree. This boy has neither." "He has something more valuable than pedigree," Eleanor replied evenly. "He has a voice. I have not heard a young musician play with that kind of honesty in years." "Honesty does not fill donor seats at a gala," Charlotte countered. "Talent claims like this deserve scrutiny before we attach our name to them. I would like to see him play again, under different conditions, before we finalize anything." Eleanor's jaw tightened, but she understood the politics of the room well enough to know that resistance would only harden Charlotte's position. Instead, she agreed, on the condition that the second evaluation would be fair, and that Daniel would be given proper notice rather than an ambush. The notice came 2 days later, delivered not by Eleanor but by a brisk, formal letter that Daniel found waiting in the mailbox when he returned from school. He read it twice on the stairwell before showing it to Ruth, his hands unsteady as he unfolded the paper a second time to be certain he had understood it correctly. The scholarship committee, the letter explained, required a second evaluation performance, to be held in 1 week's time, in front of the full governing board, before the offer could be formally confirmed. Ruth read the letter slowly at the kitchen table, her reading glasses perched on her nose, her expression unreadable for a long moment. Then she set it down and looked at Daniel with the same steady calm she had carried through every hospital appointment, every stack of unpaid bills, every hard season of their life together. "They want to make certain," she said simply. "That is not the same as doubting you. Certainty and doubt only look similar from the outside." Daniel was not entirely convinced, but he did not argue. That week became one of the most demanding of his life. Eleanor arranged for him to use one of the program's practice rooms after hours, a small space with a real grand piano, better than anything he had ever touched before, its keys smooth and perfectly balanced beneath his fingers. He spent every free hour there, sometimes staying so late that a security guard named Nathan had to remind him gently that the building needed to close for the night. He did not simply rehearse the piece he had already played. He refined it, reworked certain passages, deepened the emotional arc in places where he sensed the music could say even more than it already had. He wanted the second performance to be not a repetition, but a fuller, truer version of what he had first offered the world in that audition hall. Meanwhile, whispers about the upcoming evaluation spread through the program's student body, and not all of them were kind. A talented older student named Gabriel Hartley, widely regarded as the program's top pianist and a favorite of several board members, made his opinion known during a break between classes, speaking loudly enough that he clearly intended to be overheard. "It's strange, isn't it?" Gabriel said to a small group of classmates. glancing toward Daniel across the hallway. One good performance, and suddenly he gets a scholarship the rest of us worked years for. Makes you wonder if it was even really him playing that day, or if someone helped. The accusation, absurd as it was, found its way back to the committee within hours, twisted slightly with each retelling, until it arrived at Charlotte Whitfield's desk, as something closer to a formal concern. Charlotte, already inclined toward caution, seized on the rumor as further justification for a stricter evaluation, and the tone of the upcoming performance shifted from a formality into something closer to a trial. Eleanor confronted Gabriel privately, her voice low and controlled but carrying an edge that left no room for argument. "You will apologize to that boy," she said, "and you will never repeat something so careless again. Talent like his does not need to be explained away simply because it makes other people uncomfortable." Gabriel, chastened, offered a stiff and unconvincing apology to Daniel in the hallway the next day, though the damage to the atmosphere around the evaluation had already been done. Daniel tried not to let it shake him, but some nights, lying awake in the small apartment while Ruth slept in the next room, doubt crept in anyway, quiet and persistent, whispering that perhaps he had imagined the significance of that first performance, that perhaps the second evaluation would reveal it as nothing more than a fortunate accident. Ruth noticed the shadows under his eyes one evening, and sat beside him on the old piano bench, saying nothing for a long moment before speaking. "You are allowed to be afraid," she said. "Fear does not mean you are wrong about yourself. It only means the moment matters to you." "What if I play it and it isn't the same?" Daniel admitted quietly. "What if that first time was just luck?" Ruth considered this carefully, the way she considered most important questions, before answering. "Luck does not know how to grieve," she said. "Luck does not know your grandfather's hands, or the sound of 2 broken keys, or how many nights you practiced in silence so I could sleep. What you played in that room did not come from luck, Daniel. It came from everything you have lived. That will not disappear simply because a room full of strangers wants to watch you prove it twice." The night before the evaluation, Daniel could not sleep at all. He sat at the old upright piano in the dim apartment, playing softly, careful not to wake Ruth, working through the piece one final time, not out of anxiety now, but out of something closer to gratitude. He thought of every person who had ever doubted him, every whispered comment, every unkind glance, and instead of letting the anger sharpen into bitterness, he let it settle into resolve. He would not play to prove Gabriel wrong, or to satisfy Charlotte Whitfield's skepticism. He would play because the music itself deserved to be heard honestly, regardless of who was listening or why. The following afternoon, Daniel arrived at the theater, dressed in the same second-hand jacket he had worn to the first audition, though this time he wore it without apology, without any attempt to hide the frayed cuffs or the small tear near one pocket. Ruth walked beside him for as long as her energy allowed, though she remained in the lobby rather than the main hall, her heart no longer able to handle long periods of standing or stress without rest. Inside the audition hall, the atmosphere felt entirely different from the crowded, chaotic energy of the open auditions the week before. This time, only the full governing board sat at the long table, along with Eleanor Vance seated slightly apart from the others, her expression carefully neutral, though her eyes carried a warning aimed squarely at anyone who might treat the moment unfairly. Charlotte Whitfield sat at the center of the table, her posture rigid, a folder of notes open in front of her. "Whenever you are ready, Mr. Ashworth," Charlotte said, her tone crisp and businesslike, betraying nothing of her earlier skepticism, though the challenge in her eyes remained unmistakable. Daniel walked to the piano, sat down, and placed his hands on the keys. For a brief moment, silence stretched across the hall, heavy and expectant, entirely unlike the dismissive silence of the previous week. This time, every person in the room was watching closely, waiting to see whether the story they had heard could survive a second telling. He began to play. The opening notes were softer than before, more deliberate, as though Daniel understood now that this performance carried a different kind of weight, one that required patience rather than urgency. The melody unfolded slowly, the same searching quality present in the first audition, but with subtle changes woven throughout. Small refinements he had discovered during his long nights in the practice room, with the security guard, Nathan, occasionally passing by the door to listen for a few quiet minutes before continuing his rounds. Charlotte Whitfield sat with her pen poised above her notepad, prepared to record observations with the same critical precision she applied to every evaluation she had conducted over the years. For the first 30 seconds she wrote nothing, simply listening, her expression carefully guarded. But as the piece began to build, as the melody shifted from its mournful opening into something richer and more complex, her pen remained motionless above the paper, forgotten entirely. Daniel's fingers moved with the same startling precision that had silenced the room the week before. But there was something additional present now, a confidence that came not from arrogance but from ownership. He was no longer simply performing a piece he had written in secret, late at night, uncertain whether anyone would ever hear it. He was presenting it as something he now understood clearly belonged to him, regardless of what any committee decided. The board members exchanged glances midway through the piece, subtle but unmistakable, the kind of silent communication that passes between people who are all thinking the same surprised thought at once. One older gentleman near the end of the table, a retired conductor named Peter Halloway who had reviewed hundreds of the city's most promising young musicians over his long career, set down his own pen entirely and simply closed his eyes, allowing the music to wash over him without the distraction of formal notes. Eleanor Vance watched not the piano but the faces around the table, satisfaction growing steadily behind her carefully neutral expression as she witnessed doubt after doubt dissolve in real time. She had known, from the very first note of the original audition, that this moment would come, that skepticism would eventually surrender to simple, undeniable truth. She had only needed to be patient enough to let the music speak for itself, exactly as it was doing now. The piece reached its climax, the same swelling combination of sorrow and triumph that had first stunned the audition hall, and this time, Daniel allowed himself to lean slightly into the emotion, his shoulders rising and falling with the intensity of the passage, his eyes closed, fully present inside the music, rather than merely performing it for evaluation. When the final chord rang out and slowly faded into silence, nobody at the long table moved for several long seconds. Charlotte Whitfield was the first to speak, though her voice, when it finally came, carried none of the sharp skepticism from days earlier. That, she said quietly, was not luck. Eleanor allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, though she said nothing, letting Charlotte's own words settle into the room without interruption. Peter Halloway opened his eyes and looked directly at Daniel, his expression unusually soft for a man known throughout the city for his exacting standards. "Young man," he said, "in 40 years of listening to auditions, I have heard exactly 3 performances that made me forget I was supposed to be judging them. Yours is the 4th. Daniel, still seated at the piano, felt something loosen in his chest that had been tightly wound since the moment the letter arrived in his mailbox a week earlier. He had not realized how much weight he had been carrying until it began, slowly, to lift. Charlotte closed her folder without reviewing a single written note, setting it aside as though it had become irrelevant. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Ashworth," she said, her voice carrying the particular discomfort of someone unaccustomed to admitting error. "I questioned whether your talent was genuine. I see now that the only mistake was my own hesitation to trust what I heard the first time." Daniel did not know how to respond to that, so he simply nodded, unsure whether gratitude or relief was the stronger feeling rising inside him. The committee voted unanimously that afternoon to confirm the scholarship, along with an additional gesture that Eleanor proposed on the spot, one that surprised even Daniel. Rather than quietly folding him into the program's regular schedule, the board agreed to feature him as a headline performer at the Spring Showcase, an annual event that drew donors, press, and prominent figures from the city's wider arts community. It was, Eleanor explained afterward, both an opportunity and a statement. A chance for Daniel to perform his original composition on the largest stage the program had to offer, and a clear signal to anyone still doubting his place among their most talented students. Word of the second evaluation spread through the program even faster than the first audition had. This time, the story arrived already softened by admiration rather than skepticism, and even Gabriel Hartley, still faintly embarrassed by his earlier comments, approached Daniel in the hallway a few days later, with a stiff but sincere congratulation. "I was wrong about you," Gabriel said, extending his hand. "That piece deserves the stage they're giving you." Daniel shook his hand, choosing to let the earlier unkindness fade rather than dwell on it, understanding somehow that holding on to resentment would only weigh him down as the biggest performance of his life approached. That evening, walking home from the theater with the late spring air cool against his face, Daniel could not wait to share the news with Ruth. He found her sitting in her usual chair by the window, a blanket over her knees, her face pale but her eyes alert the moment he stepped through the door. "They confirmed it," he said, breathless, still holding his backpack over one shoulder. "The scholarship, and they want me to perform at the Spring Showcase. The real one, with donors and press and everything." Ruth's eyes filled with tears almost immediately, though her smile remained steady, unwavering, the same expression she had worn through every difficult season of their life together. "Come here," she said, patting the empty space on the small sofa beside her chair. Daniel sat down, and Ruth reached for his hand, holding it the way she had held it in countless hospital hallways and parking lots over the years, though this time the weight in her grip carried joy instead of worry. "Your grandfather would have loved to hear you play that piece," she said softly. "He always said the piano tells the truth about a person, even when they try to hide it. You never hid anything, Daniel, not once." They sat together in comfortable silence for a long while, the late afternoon light slanting through the thin curtains, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily through the small living room, much like the golden light that had filled the audition hall on the day everything began to change. Ruth's health remained fragile, her heart requiring careful monitoring and daily medication, but in that quiet moment, neither of them allowed worry to intrude on the happiness they had both earned through years of patient sacrifice. In the weeks that followed, Daniel's life took on a new rhythm entirely. He attended lessons with instructors far more advanced than anything he had previously experienced, absorbing new techniques with the same hungry enthusiasm that had first impressed Peter Lindquist years earlier. Eleanor personally oversaw much of his preparation for the showcase, refining small details in his performance, though she was careful never to smooth away the raw honesty that had made his playing so powerful in the first place. "Do not let anyone teach that out of you," she told him during one late rehearsal, watching him work through a difficult passage. "Technique can always improve. What you carry inside the music cannot be taught, and it must never be polished away." As the date of the spring showcase approached, posters began appearing throughout the theater and across parts of the city, advertising the event to donors and community members alike. Daniel's name appeared among a list of featured performers, printed in the same elegant lettering as musicians who had trained for years under the program's most celebrated instructors. Seeing his own name printed there, surrounded by unfamiliar but accomplished names, still felt surreal each time he passed one of the posters in the hallway. Ruth insisted on attending the showcase in person, despite gentle protests from Daniel, who worried the long evening might prove too demanding for her fragile heart. She dismissed his concerns with the same unshakable determination she had shown throughout his entire life. "I did not survive this long," she said firmly, "just to miss the night my grandson finally gets to show the world what I have known about him since he was small enough to sit on my lap at that old piano." Daniel could not argue with that, and truthfully, he did not want to. Having Ruth in the audience mattered more to him than any donor, any journalist, or any member of the governing board who might be watching that night. Everything he had built toward this moment traced back to her steady hand guiding him through every difficulty life had placed in their path. The night before the showcase, Daniel sat once again at the old upright piano, working through his piece one final time, the two broken keys still stubbornly silent no matter how gently he pressed them. He had grown so accustomed to composing around their silence that even now, with access to the finest grand piano the program owned, he found himself instinctively leaving those same small gaps in his playing, a quiet tribute to the instrument that had shaped him long before any stage ever would. Ruth listened from her chair, her eyes closed, her breathing calm and even, a small, contented smile resting on her face, as the familiar melody filled their small apartment one last time, before it would fill a concert hall in front of hundreds of strangers. "Tomorrow," she said softly, without opening her eyes, "the whole city finally gets to hear what I have always known." Daniel finished the piece and let the final note fade into silence, the same way it always did, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, content simply to sit together in the quiet aftermath of music that had carried them both through every hardship life had offered. The evening of the spring showcase arrived with a sky painted in soft orange and violet, the kind of light that seemed almost designed for an important occasion. Daniel stood backstage in a borrowed suit, slightly too large in the shoulders but pressed neatly by Ruth's careful hands the night before, listening to the low hum of hundreds of voices filling the concert hall beyond the heavy curtain. His heart pounded steadily against his ribs, though the fear that had gripped him during the first audition had transformed into something closer to focused anticipation. Eleanor found him a few minutes before the performances were set to begin, adjusting his collar with the brisk efficiency of someone who had guided countless students through nervous moments like this one. "Remember," she said, meeting his eyes directly, "you are not proving anything to anyone tonight. You are simply telling them the truth, the same way you did the very first time. Let the music do what it already knows how to do." Daniel nodded, grateful for her steadiness, though his eyes kept drifting toward the small gap in the curtain where he could see part of the audience gathering in the rows below. Somewhere out there, in a seat close to the front that Eleanor had personally arranged, Ruth sat waiting, dressed in her best dress, a soft shawl draped over her shoulders despite the warm evening, her hands folded in her lap the way they always were whenever she watched him perform. The showcase began with several other students, each impressive in their own right, filling the hall with polished, technically flawless performances that drew warm, respectful applause from the audience. Gabriel Hartley performed near the middle of the program, a demanding concerto that showcased years of formal training, and Daniel watched from the wings, applauding sincerely alongside the rest of the backstage crowd, any earlier tension between them long since resolved. As Daniel's turn approached, a young stage assistant appeared beside him with a clipboard, checking his name off a list before gesturing toward the wings. 2 minutes, she whispered, and Daniel felt his pulse quicken, though he kept his breathing slow and even, the way he had practiced during the long weeks of preparation. Just before he was called forward, a sudden commotion rippled through a section of the audience near the front, and Daniel's stomach dropped as he caught a glimpse of movement near where Ruth had been sitting. He strained to see through the narrow gap in the curtain, his chest tightening with alarm as he spotted Eleanor hurrying down the side aisle toward that same section. For a terrifying moment, panic threatened to override everything else, memories of hospital hallways and worried doctors flooding back with sudden, sharp clarity. He took an involuntary step toward the stage exit, ready to abandon the performance entirely, when the stage assistant gently caught his arm. "Wait," she said softly. "Let them handle it. You need to trust that." Daniel forced himself to remain still, every muscle tense, his eyes fixed on the small gap in the curtain as he watched Eleanor kneel briefly beside Ruth's seat. After what felt like an unbearable stretch of seconds, Eleanor straightened, said something to a nearby event coordinator, and then looked directly toward the wings, catching Daniel's eye and offering a small, reassuring nod, along with a raised hand signaling that everything was under control. It turned out, as Daniel would learn only minutes later, that Ruth had simply grown briefly lightheaded from the warmth of the crowded hall, combined with the excitement of the evening, nothing more serious than that, though it had been enough to startle the people seated nearest her. A member of the event staff quickly brought water and a portable fan, and within a few minutes, Ruth was sitting upright again, waving off further concern, with the same stubborn determination she applied to everything in her life, insisting she felt perfectly capable of watching her grandson perform. Still, the brief scare left Daniel's hands trembling slightly as his name was finally announced, the audience applauding politely as he walked out from the wings into the bright stage lights, his eyes immediately searching the front rows until he found Ruth, pale but smiling, giving him a small, encouraging wave that steadied something deep inside his chest. He crossed the stage and sat down at the grand piano, larger and more magnificent than any instrument he had ever played, its polished black surface reflecting the warm stage lights above. For a brief moment, the enormity of the evening threatened to overwhelm him entirely, hundreds of unfamiliar faces watching in expectant silence, donors and journalists and respected musicians all waiting to hear whether the story they had heard about him could possibly be true. Then his eyes found Ruth again, sitting perfectly still now, her hands folded in her lap exactly as they always were, her eyes bright despite the earlier scare, and every trace of doubt dissolved completely. Daniel placed his hands on the keys and began to play. The opening notes drifted out into the silent hall, soft and searching, exactly as they had been from the very beginning, carrying within them every hospital hallway, every silent practice session with foam pads and borrowed headphones, every sacrifice Ruth had made without complaint across the difficult years of his childhood. The melody built slowly, the same mournful beauty present in every previous performance, but tonight something additional had entered the music, a fullness born from everything that had happened since that first frightening audition. The doubt that had been overcome, the friendships slowly rebuilt, the scholarship that had changed the entire shape of his future. The audience sat perfectly still, captivated in the same way every previous listener had been, though this time the silence carried the added weight of hundreds of people simultaneously realizing they were witnessing something they would remember for years afterward. Journalists in the back rows set down their notepads entirely, forgetting momentarily that they were supposed to be documenting the evening rather than simply experiencing it. Donors who had funded the program for decades exchanged quiet, astonished glances, recognizing immediately that they were hearing something far beyond a typical student showcase performance. Charlotte Whitfield, seated near the front alongside the rest of the governing board, watched with an expression that mixed pride and quiet vindication, having become, in the weeks since the second evaluation, one of Daniel's most vocal supporters within the organization. The piece continued building, note after note layering into something increasingly powerful. The same swelling combination of sorrow and triumph that had first captured Eleanor's attention weeks earlier, except now performed with the full confidence of a young musician who finally understood, completely and without reservation, exactly where he belonged. Daniel's shoulders rose and fell with the emotional intensity of the passage, his eyes closed, fully immersed within the music, no longer aware of the hundreds of watching faces, aware only of the sound filling the enormous hall around him. In the front row, Ruth pressed a trembling hand against her chest, tears sliding freely down her weathered cheeks, though her smile never wavered, radiant with a pride too large to contain quietly. Beside her, Eleanor reached over and gently squeezed her shoulder, both women watching together as the boy they had each fought so hard to support finally claimed the stage that had always, in some sense, belonged to him. The final section of the piece arrived, the melody softening once again, circling back toward the same gentle, searching phrase that had opened the composition, though now it no longer sounded like a question. It sounded like an answer delivered with complete certainty, the culmination of every hardship transformed into something beautiful and undeniable. Daniel's fingers slowed, the notes spacing further apart, building toward the final chord with unhurried, deliberate patience. When his hands finally came to rest on that last chord, letting it ring out and slowly fade into complete silence, the hall remained still for a long, suspended moment, the same stunned quiet that had followed his very first audition weeks earlier, except magnified now by the size of the crowd and the significance of the occasion. Then the silence broke entirely. Applause erupted from every corner of the concert hall, rising quickly into a sustained, thunderous wave of sound as the audience rose to their feet almost as one, hundreds of hands clapping, several voices calling out in enthusiastic approval. Daniel opened his eyes, momentarily disoriented by the sudden noise after the intense concentration of performing, and found the entire hall standing, Ruth among them despite her fragile condition, clapping with tears still streaming freely down her face, her joy visible even from the distance of the stage. Eleanor stood beside her, applauding with unrestrained enthusiasm entirely unlike her usual composed professionalism, while Charlotte Whitfield and the rest of the governing board rose together near the front, their earlier skepticism now completely transformed into open admiration. Even Gabriel Hartley, seated further back among the other student performers, clapped enthusiastically, calling out encouragement that carried clearly over the general noise of the crowd. Daniel rose from the piano bench slowly, still slightly overwhelmed by the intensity of the response, and offered a small, humble bow, unable to stop the wide, genuine smile spreading across his face. As he straightened, his eyes found Ruth once more, and despite the enormous crowd separating them, he felt as though they were the only two people in the entire hall, exactly as it had always felt during every quiet evening spent together at their old broken piano. After the showcase concluded, well-wishers surrounded Daniel backstage, donors introducing themselves eagerly, journalists requesting brief interviews, fellow students offering warm congratulations that felt entirely different from the whispered laughter that had greeted him weeks earlier at his very first audition. Through the crowd, Eleanor guided Ruth gently toward him, and the moment Daniel spotted her, he broke away from the surrounding conversations entirely, moving quickly to wrap his arms around his grandmother in a tight, grateful embrace. "You did it," Ruth whispered against his shoulder, her voice thick with emotion. "Everything I always believed about you. The whole city finally heard it too. We did it," Daniel corrected gently, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes. "None of this happens without you. Not the lessons, not the practice, not any of it." Ruth laughed softly, wiping at her eyes with the edge of her shawl. "Your grandfather would have been so proud," she said. "I only wish he could have heard you tonight." "He heard tonight," Daniel said quietly. "I made sure of that." In the weeks that followed, Daniel's life changed in ways neither he nor Ruth could have fully anticipated. Requests for performances began arriving from other venues across the city, and Eleanor carefully guided him through each new opportunity, always protective of the authenticity that had first made his playing so remarkable. Ruth's health remained carefully managed, her medication adjusted slightly after the brief scare at the showcase, though she attended every performance she possibly could, always seated in the front row, always the first person Daniel searched for whenever he stepped onto a new stage. The old upright piano remained in their small apartment, the two broken keys never repaired, a quiet reminder of everything that had shaped Daniel's journey long before any grand stage had welcomed him. He continued practicing on it regularly, even as his skills carried him toward increasingly prestigious opportunities, unwilling to abandon the instrument that had taught him, through its very limitations, how to create something beautiful out of whatever circumstances life happened to provide. Years later, when Daniel would eventually perform on stages far larger than that first concert hall, in cities he had once only read about in library books, he would always begin his most important performances the same way, closing his eyes briefly before placing his hands on the keys, remembering a small apartment with a leaking ceiling, a grandmother who refused to let sacrifice defeat love, and 2 broken keys that had somehow taught him everything he would ever need to know about turning hardship into music the whole world could finally hear.